Mark, welcome back. It's great to be with you again. You've done so much. You've been so many places in the regulatory and policymaking space, as well as in the automotive innovation space and the mobility innovation space. So, I want to kind of go back and forth between those two hats. And so I want to start with a question that is going to ask you to think about it from both perspectives, really maybe at the same time. So we're at this, as an auto industry, we're at this big inflection point, right? There is enormous transformation happening, massive amounts of investment. And the companies that you see are downstairs and around this room are innovating at incredible speed, and they're creating more connected, more automated, and lower emissions technologies, and they're improving safety on the roadway. So what's the best way to leverage all of this innovation? So how do you think about how we accelerate the deployment of these technologies from a regulating perspective and from an innovation perspective?
So this has taken a while to think about exactly what you said, sort of the different worldviews and how do you put them together. And for a little while, I've been talking about really these 3 steps that are on the safety path. It starts with innovation, and frankly, the industry does that, right? I mean, think about it, DARPA challenge, NHTSA stuff, it's like, government doesn't actually create it. It challenges you to do it, but it's like, go out, and I'm sure we'll talk about AEB as an example of that.
Yes, we will.
But, it's really the innovation is the industry doing that. And we need as much creativity there as we can. But that leads to the next step, which is data-driven best practices. Because you got to go from just let's experiment, let's try this out, et cetera, to saying which are the ones that are going to break through, and that should be data-based. So basically the data should justify that it's okay to move forward on this. And those really are the basis then for creating best practices, which gets it out into the fleet. You kind of go from all of this big picture to maybe the few, right? But it doesn't really hold you or constrain you in any way. And that leads to the third part, which is that's when the regulation happens, right? And if you think about it, when you're doing the regulation, you want to look to those data-driven best practices that exist, because that's the data that allow you to do cost benefit, right? I mean, there's real stuff that's got to happen if you wanted to get to regulation. And so you need penetration of the fleet, you need data that's going to show it's going to work, you need to see people are using it and that it's effective for what you expect, right? And then you have the foundation to be able to do the regulation. And I say that because that's kind of the path we've actually been on, but we're not very explicit about it usually.
Yeah, well, that's interesting, right? Because I think, it might be news to some people even that NHTSA is data-driven. And it's certainly not news to technology innovators and sort of regulators that are, from NHTSA or Department of Transportation here in the room. But I think there is a sense among maybe some lay people that NHTSA just says, do this because it's a good idea or because somebody asks you to do this, and you do it, and then the automakers follow. So let's talk a little bit more about what the role of NHTSA is in terms of developing that, like, how do you develop the perspective about where we want to go and encourage the creation of the data that you use for rulemaking?
So that's a great question, and I get to be a little pushy and obnoxious, because I think when people refer to NHTSA as the regulatory agency, they're the regulator, I'm always kind of like bristle up a bit. It's like, it's a safety agency. One of the tools it has available is regulation, but it takes a long time. There's a very rigorous process, et cetera. And if you care about safety on the road, where the lives actually get saved, then you got to NHTSA has to use its full range of tools that are available. And I think that was one of the things, that have surprised people at different points in NHTSA's history. It's like, sometimes you're using more tools than people think of, because they're just thinking regulator. But where's the regulation on that? As opposed to, well, you can fund certain safety practices that are going to see other things happen. You can hold meetings. You can be explicit about responsibilities and authorities between feds and the states, for example. There's a lot of stuff you can do to support safety that isn't just regulation. It is the unique part of what NHTSA gets to do, right? So having been at NTSB, a superb organization that does these incredible investigations, et cetera, but they're not going to do the regulation part for you, right? They just don't have. So NHTSA has a set of tools. Regulation is one of the more unique ones. But again, it's got to fit within that safety path that I was talking about. So you make sure that you are nourishing that innovation, see it as much as you can, but really push people to get the data that are going to justify taking it to an eventual regulation, or at least industry-wide.
Yeah, I think those are really important points. You know, NHTSA, for example, has a research agenda and a research game plan and a research department, I guess, for lack of a better term. Right? So that's one of the tools in the toolbox. I'm reflecting back on your NHTSA tenure, and I'm thinking about how you put in practice a couple of the points you just made. We'll get to AEB in a second, because I think that's a really good case study. But even before that, I'm thinking about the exercise of bringing the industry together around a set of what I think we called at the time proactive safety principles. And so talk a little bit about that. That was using convening power, right? And maybe your authority as a regulator, but you weren't regulating at that point, but you were still achieving safety outcomes. So tell us a little bit about that.
So we're going to have a discussion, but don't make me cry. Because I think what you're highlighting is the innovation that NHTSA was trying to do.
Right.
Don't just think of us as a regulator. And yeah, if we hold a meeting, people are going to show up, and we know that. And if we challenge the industry, it's kind of like people are going to respond and think about that sort of thing. And so again, I think you've identified that if you see NHTSA's mission as saving lives, preventing injuries, et cetera, then you're looking for all the tools that are available to get that done. Right? And so you think about it, we convened a lot of meetings. You know, Allison Pascal, I used to joke, but it's like, you know, we have this, we used to have a name for it, the Rose Garden. It was like, okay, we're gonna have another Rose Garden meeting. Let's have the one on, you know, how do we get to 100% defect recall kinds of percentages? How do we get people talking about proactive safety? And I think part of that came from acknowledging that the agency needed to help the whole industry, all of us, shift to one that was more proactive. This is why we're going to talk about AEB, because to me it's the model for avoiding things rather than just reacting afterwards. So it's proactive, but it's collaborative, and you got to acknowledge this stuff takes time.
Yeah.
And if you don't keep those three things in mind, then you're just frustrated all the time.
Yeah. You know, one of the, I should probably, because there's some people who remember the days of the proactive safety principles discussions from the industry perspective. So I'll admit this in front of a crowd. I wondered what the heck you were up to. Like, yeah, see, some of you remember. And you know, part of what we were trying to figure out as an industry is what are they doing?
Yeah.
Like, what are they trying to accomplish? Like they regulate, they do research, they have recall authority and defect investigation authority, but this is a different thing. And I think, you know, maybe this is a nice segue into sort of how you thought about industry engagements maybe a little bit more broadly. So now, you know, you did back under your tenure champion what really became, in at least in my view, kind of a landmark voluntary agreement to deploy automatic emergency braking. This was long before the regulator was regulating in the space, but you recognized that the innovators were innovating. And so tell us a little bit about what was your thought process that led to this voluntary agreement.
Yeah, I think I'm going to do a quick ending moment, which is it's great to see the AEB reg that came out, but I think for this discussion, what's really critical is to go back to the beginning, because you remember September 11, 2015, we were at IIHS. They had a new building, a crash test facility, and we did the challenge. Yep. And there were 10 OEMs at the time who had said, we'll talk to you about how to figure this out. And by the time we actually got the group together, it was 20, and it represented like 98, 99% of all new vehicles that were going to be out in the United States, right? And I really give a lot of credit to Nat Buse and David Ruby, who's at IHS, yes. And the two of them were the brain trust that got together. And it's your point. We convened, but when NHTSA held the meeting, everyone showed up, you know. And I just want to give them credit, because I think the industry needs to get huge credit. If you think about it, this is that first step. The industry went out and innovated and turned it into a data-driven best practice. And I say that because I don't think there's enough credit all around to NHTSA's role, IHS, the safety people, and the industry in particular that put it in the vehicles to make it standard by 2022. This is literally the model of democratizing safety, right?
Yeah.
And in fact, the current rule wouldn't be possible without that penetration of the fleet. I just saw David do a great presentation. About 55% of rear-end crashes, if you've got AEB, we're seeing about 55% decrease in rear-end crashes. That's data-driven best practices. That should be everywhere. Good for NHTSA for now being able to take that and turn it into a rule. And there'll be plenty of discussions about what that should look like in the whatever, et cetera. But I think, again, collaborative. You got to give the industry credit for all their innovation work that's going on, the data-driven best practices, then you can end up in a regulation somewhere. And by the way, that date of 2029 that's in there from when we did the first in 2000, it's like 14 years before we're going to actually see. It takes a long time.
Right. Yeah, and the initial commitment that was made, the industry achieved it.
Yes.
Right. And so now I want to.
Sorry, before you go to another point, not only did it achieve it, many people did it years earlier.
Yes.
And at a higher level. It's like, here's what the floor is, but we're going to do this. So, I mean, credit needs to go all around. NHTSA's done a good job with the current, to figure out the reg, et cetera, but it started with, and again, Nat, David, all those folks, but the industry stepped up, and it wasn't just meat. There were plenty of people that exceeded it by doing it early or even going to a higher level.
Yeah. So I want to sort of pick at this a little bit. So I think certainly what you're talking about here is the ability for a collaboration or a convening of NHTSA and the industry, other partners like IHS to come together to develop a data set that the regulator could then use. I want to step further back from that. And you talked about Nat Buse, who was running research at the time. Don't we need, or do we need, or maybe you think we already have it, an aligned research agenda between the industry, NHTSA, and maybe other, what I'd call, I don't know, public domain type safety experts? Should we, and again, from where I sit, I don't see it. And would innovation and deployment of life-saving technologies benefit from an aligned midterm to long-term research agenda?
Yeah, and I'll actually add to that list, which is, I think, as you were just pointing out, NHTSA has great convening authority, convening gravitas to call people in. And I think that's where safety leadership happens from the agency. It gets to basically say, we need a research agenda, we need a regulatory agenda, we need a best practices agenda. We need all, not that NHTSA is going to do all of those. It has unique tools like the regulation, but think about it. AVSC, which is associated with SAE, they're putting out best practices.
Right.
Okay, great. A whole bunch of academic settings are doing research and things. Great. So is NHTSA, right? I mean, there's stuff going on all over the place. And again, I think part of the safety leadership opportunity is to hold those convening meetings that basically say, what do we all agree needs to be done? Where can we get it done? Where do we need the funding? By the way, we got to make sure there is a central point to bring all of that data together, whether it's best practice stuff or research data, et cetera, so we have the benefit to everybody for that, rather than just an academic publication here or it's a regulatory meeting there, et cetera. So I think you could expand what you just said and put it into regulations, best practices, all those with the research part, and say, what's the agenda and how do we make sure we all benefit from the outcomes of those efforts?
Yeah, I agree with that. And because, I mean, there are billions of dollars being invested. And to make sure that those investments pay off, and by pay off, I mean pay off in terms of lives saved, crashes reduced, there should be more alignment. I think that there is, I love the AEB story that starts with the voluntary agreement. I might argue that what might have been missing between that voluntary agreement and the final rule was a research agenda that aligned us through that voluntary agreement toward where the rule ultimately went. because I think from some technologists and some innovators might have been surprised at some of those outcomes. That doesn't mean the goal was wrong. Goal's dead on, right? Focusing on AEB and PAEB, pedestrian automatic pedestrian protection, using the same technology for those of you scoring at home, is critical. But the research agenda, I think, provides alignment so that those billions of dollars are spent on a purpose that both the technologists and the regulators agree is the right direction.
Well, what you're
would you quarrel with that?
Yeah, well, I think what it highlights is we've lacked the collaboration that would get us there. So we still got there, but it was probably took longer, harder, and more expensive than if we had everybody in the room agreeing on what research, what data do we need, let's collaborate on that, et cetera. So we're all working toward one goal, all doing our part to make sure we get there. We still got there, but I think to your point, there weren't some of these convening collaborative meetings to basically say, let's lay it out. And by the way, you're responsible for doing this, and you're responsible for doing that, and and we're going to be back here, and whether it's by quarter or year, and say, let's figure out what this is. And I'm biased. I think that's part of NHTSA's role. Just because of its authority and stuff, it needs to be out there trying to hold those meetings. Again, you don't have to regulate everything. You could just bring people together.
Appreciate that. I want you to put your private sector hat back on, your Zooks hat specifically. I think probably everybody in the room knows that you were the Chief Safety Innovation Officer at Zooks. And when you were in that role, we had a chance, we visited together in Silicon Valley, and we had a chance to talk about the promise of highly automated vehicle technology to reduce fatalities, to increase safety, to provide more mobility for people who don't currently have access to mobility. You've been out of that for a couple of years. Meanwhile, we've seen this kind of up and down and churn and Sturm und Drang about what's happening in the sort of AV space. So I'm going to ask you directly, do you still believe now what you believed then in terms of the promise of this technology?
Even more so. And if you get to sit in any of these vehicles that are good, you realize you're riding in the future. And so it's one of my pet peeves. I won't give it much air, but all the surveys that say, oh, I don't know, it's like, those are people that don't even know how to spell autonomous vehicles. And so it's really critical, I think. It's like, let's get people educated, even better is experience, because we do have data that shows if you experience it, you're not just more open to it, it's like, yeah, this could be great, okay? So he's not here, I can say this, but my son is a robotics engineer, and so I have this inside intel, and you know what? The technology will figure all this stuff out. I don't have any question about that, actually. I think the biggest challenge, which I've seen for a few years now, is the actual deployment in cities. So whether that's pickup and drop off kind of things, if you're going to have an electric fleet, what do you charge? How do you work with the local governments to make sure it's actually integrated into public transit as opposed to being competitive with it, right? It's like the real world challenges of how you operate something new and innovative. And so when I was administrator, people were like, when's this going to get here? 20 or 30 years. People ask me, it's still going to be 20 or 30 years. And when I say that, it's because if you want to leave Audi Field and go out and get your app, for any of them, Zoox, Waymo, Cruise, and whatever else is yet to be created, it's like 20 or 30 years, We have some great projects going on, pilots, demos, whatever you want to call them, actually even charging people, et cetera. But when you can go out to your corner where you live and get it, that is 20 or 30 years, right? I mean, it's going to take a while. And I point out for all of us in safety, right, we need to be proactive, collaborative, and realize it takes a long time. Even if one of those companies was perfect and we put all their vehicles on the road, the reality is we still got folks driving with their hands and being distracted, drunk, drugged, and drowsy. And then we've got a bunch of people with ADAS, and then we'll have autonomous vehicles. So even if you had a AV company that was going to be perfect, you still wouldn't get to zero right away, because that system out there, 280 million vehicles that are on the road, taking what? The average now is 12.6 years that people. Yep. Yeah, so I mean, flipping that fleet to get all this stuff, that's a 20 or 30 year. We don't always often look at that long range. And again, I think we're going to need to see this deployed in cities, then scaled, and be thinking literally 20 or 30 years to where we're not even, worried or thinking about it anymore.
So what can we do? You talked about the technology. What can we do from a policy standpoint to accelerate this? There are a lot of policymakers in the room now and through the rest of the day. What can we be doing from a policy perspective to help AV technology deliver on its promise?
So this is not a secret because I've actually talked about this publicly and sent this list to everything from the Secretary's office to NHTSA and others.
Newsflash.
Well, that's to say this is not like, but there's a few things I think that we could be doing. One, for example, in the AV space that's really critical is there's a lot of confusion about responsibilities and authorities between federal, state, and even with cities. And this is a great opportunity for NHTSA, for example, if Adam is still listening to what we're talking about here. I know Sophie's out of town, but it's sort of like you could have a meeting and just say, let's get together and actually be clear to everybody. In fact, in the first AV policy document we put out, we address that. Here's what the feds do, here's what the states do. It's very confused. We warned about a patchwork. That's what we've got. So you know what? Have a meeting and clarify what that is, just to be clear, and identify the gaps, and as we talked about before, assign responsibility to fill those gaps. So there's no longer confusion. There's not like, what are we doing in this area? Another one, which you've heard me talk about many times, I'll make it quick, but having been a NASA scientist and seeing how effective aviation has been in safety, why are we not sharing safety data? And I have this mantra, which is never again. If somebody dies in an AV incident where there's a crash and something happens, that should happen once. The data gets shared with everybody, never again. It's like your company, your company, your company shouldn't have to have the same thing happen before we figure out how you each solve that problem. That's insanity, right? And so I think that's another place where that's not new. Aviation's been doing it for 15 years or so. Everybody's worried about the intellectual property, IP stuff, et cetera. Been figured out, all kinds of ways to keep it anonymous, protect your IP. It's just, you need to share relevant safety data. Because as you're saying, if you want to get trust, both with the regulatory environment, with the public, et cetera, part of it is making sure people know that here's what we're looking at. And again, innovation, you can have different ways of doing it, but let the data drive what the best practices become, right? So I think those are like just two examples of the kind of things right now we could do. And by the way, let's be clear, there's an election coming up, there's all kinds of turmoil, but that doesn't mean we have to just wait, right?
Exactly. So, okay, we're probably just about at time or maybe even a little bit over. I could talk to you all day about this. Let me just ask a question now. So we talked about technology, we talked about policy. How important is public awareness to this discussion? You could make an argument that we have already the building blocks of highly automated vehicles on the roadway today in the form of advanced automated driving assist systems. You can see downstairs, those of you who haven't been downstairs yet, shameless promotion, go down and look at how, for example, advanced cognitive driver monitoring can support advanced automated driver assistance systems. So you're seeing the building blocks now. Theoretically, one might argue, wow, I'm getting more and more familiar with automation and how automation works, and how transparent it can be to the driving and transportation experience. Therefore, I should be open to this and comfortable with this and wanting this, and yet the data doesn't suggest that that's the case. What do we do about that, and how can we, unless you think it's not important, if you can, we can end it there, but if it is important, how can we build public awareness around the promise and the benefits of technology that you're still optimistic about?
Well, and I got to tell you, I think this is actually a good point to end on, because I actually think what you're talking about is the first step. We can do all this cool technology stuff, but if people don't use it or use it correctly, then it's meaningless, right? And so I really think, and you're doing it, Pave's here, they're doing it. There's a bunch of groups trying to make sure folks get informed about it. David Zuby was just showing data last couple weeks ago, actually, showing that so many people shut off their ADAS. They don't know what they've got, and even the stuff they've got, they shut it off. Okay, so you got to start with just getting everybody educated. And by the way, because of who's here, I would say one of the things is to think about dealers and OEMs, because that's the customer consumer touch point. And at this meeting we were at, they were talking about how people just want to come in, get their car, get out, et cetera. It's like, great, so take that as a challenge. This is another one. You don't need NHTSA for this. I'm famous for saying, don't wait for the government to do it for you. But I think this is a great example of the dealers are the touch point. The OEMs are another touch point that provide, so for all the really cool stuff we're seeing with virtual reality and whatever else, how do we start getting people educated in what's in their vehicle? That it could mean the difference with saving their lives versus literally walking away versus losing a family member. And then how do you get them appreciating it? And I'll just finish this part by saying, as administrator, people always said, are we going to go through all those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or are we going to jump right to the, and I think that question's been answered. Because if you think about it, what you're getting to is the public and consumers, they want to go gently through the numbers. Take me through ADAS, take me through whatever. Let me get comfortable with that. That will get them comfortable to fully automated kinds of vehicles. And so education is critical now, so people both understand, but use the technology that could start saving lives now. AEB, again, it's the model, it's the poster child for the moment. 50+% reduction in rear end. It's like, how do we get that? David had other data with blind spot monitoring, et cetera. They were at 20-25% decreases.
Amazing.
Yeah. And let me add, industry, that's your challenge, like we talked about before, is take it up. Take it up a notch. Get it to us sooner. Get it to us even better, right? And figure out how to do that. You'll save more lives.
Well, I love your point that the driver has to be along for the journey. And Mark, I want to thank you for taking us on your journey, both as a regulator, policymaker, and an innovator. Thanks for being with us today.
Always a pleasure.
Appreciate it.